Good evening. It is September 28th, 2021. It is 7:15 p.m. Welcome to the San Marino Unified School District Board of Education meeting. Here is your board president, Shelley Ryan.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. I'd like to report from closed session. The board by consensus provided direction to council regarding a July 2021 letter from the public. All right, I'd like to open the regular session. Please stand and take the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please place your hand over your heart and begin. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, may I have an approval of the agenda? This is an action item.
I make a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
A second.
Thank you, Mrs. Jack, and thank you, Mrs. Chung. With that, I'd like to do roll call. Mr. Kalaki?
Aye.
Mr. Chang?
Aye.
Mrs. Chung?
Aye.
Mrs. Jack?
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan? Aye. And student board member?
Aye.
Motion has passed for the approval of the agenda. Next, approval of minutes. This is an action item for September 14th, 2021 Board of Education meeting minutes.
Move to approve the minutes from September 14th.
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Chung and Mr. Chang. Roll call vote, Mrs. Jack,
Aye.
Mrs. Chung,
Aye.
Mr. Chang,
Aye.
Mr. Kalaki,
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan, aye. Student board member.
Aye.
All right, motion passes for the approval of the minutes. Public comment. This is a procedural item. The Board of Education has adopted Board Policy 9323B to ensure the public's right to be heard in any matters pertaining to the San Marino Unified School District. Persons who wish to provide public comment will have three options to submit public comments. Submit through an online form, request to speak during the meeting via Zoom, or request to speak during the meeting in person via the public comment card. You may submit through an online form. The public may submit public comments for the open or closed session on September 28th from 11 through 3:30. The comments received during this time will not be read during the meeting, but will be provided to the Board of Education. At the time of 3:30, there were no public comments. Request to speak during the meeting via Zoom. During public comment, the meeting will pause for 1 minute to take requests to speak. The raise hand function is used to take requests during the public comment period. For online attendees, press the raise hand icon to add yourself to the queue. And for phone attendees, dial *9. The speaking order will be determined based on the order of requests received. Individual speakers will be unmuted and called to speak. Request to speak during the meeting in person via the public comment card. Please complete the public comment card and submit the completed card to the designated drop box with the assistant to the superintendent no later than when the agenda section, items that are not on the agenda, consent, information, action is called by the board president. Opportunities for public comment are offered prior to closed session, at the start of the regular open session for items not on the agenda, and prior to consent. Information and action items for matters on the agenda. The Board of Education reserves the right to add a public comment period prior to any individual item on the agenda. 5 minutes may be allotted to each speaker, maximum of 20 minutes to each subject matter. However, in the event there are more than 4 speakers on the same subject matter, the board president retains the discretion to adjust to limit the time allocated to each speaker to ensure that all wishing to speak will be heard within the 20-minute allotment. Now we're going to hear a communication from the audience regarding matters that are not on the agenda or to be put at this time. This is an information item. Dr. Choi.
We're pausing for 1 minute to take requests to speak regarding matters not on the agenda. If you'd like to make a request to speak, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card.
Thank you.
We have 30 seconds remaining. If you would like to make a request to speak regarding matters not on the agenda, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. Okay, President Ryan, we have one request to speak via Zoom.
All right.
San Marino Teachers Association, your line is now open.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Good evening, board and our superintendent and those in attendance. This is Letitia Aranda, SMUSD president. I wanted to make a comment regarding the compensation for teachers. So it was brought to my attention that San Marino teachers had received a raise within the last 4 years. And I wanted to clarify, because there is such a thing as letter of the law and spirit of the law. Let me remind the board that when we had a presentation 3 years back, we were reminded, or we were told, that the San Marino teachers ranked 14 out of 19 as far as pay was concerned. We were in 14th place out of 19. And we were given 2 days less on the calendar, which amounted to a small increase, but we were given additional target solution assignments, which have to be done on our own time, which eats away at any time that we might have been given as far as time off and compensation. So we're still at a wash. There are 7 pots of money that the state has granted that have been related to COVID. 3 of those pots specifically say the monies should be used for salaries. We have not seen any of that money, and it is simply a reminder to the board that as we continue with working towards compensation for teachers, we be aware of that. And once again, we understand that for the first time in a long time, our district is in the black, $7 million, over $7 million, 1 million being earmarked for funds that cannot be used for compensation. Please, we know that the board is anxiously engaged in trying to cover costs incurred by the Barth Athletic, by the gym, and everyone is for fiscal responsibility. But please, please do not allow it, I plead, to this fiscal responsibility to be done on the backs of teachers. Please put your teachers first, please. Please be reminded of the great efforts everyone went to provide excellent education in a time when most schools were closed. Please look into other districts and find out what compensations were granted. Your teachers are so deserving. I speak as the SMTA president, but I am a teacher and I represent teachers. And please, in your conversations, as you talk about the needs, think about the needs of those who serve our most vulnerable population. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your energies. And we hope for good things in the future. Good evening.
Thank you. Any other?
Nope, that's
All
it.
right. Next, we have requests submitted for public comment. I'd like to invite up to the podium Katrine Huang.
Hi, my name is Katrin Huang. I'm a mother of two Valentine students. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss the indoor mask mandate. I'm here to be a voice for my children and for those who are intimidated to speak up. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have 8 years of experience working as a registered nurse at a county hospital. I know how to use a mask appropriately, and I know N95 respirator masks need to be fit tested regularly. I am not anti-mask, I am pro-choice. According to the CDC and the American Council of Science and Health, children between the ages 5 to 14 have a survival rate of 99.99% from COVID-19. Evidence suggests that as many as half of pediatric infections may be asymptomatic. During an interview in 2020, Dr. Anthony Fauci, our infectious disease expert and chief medical advisor to our president, stated, "The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person." Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, Fauci discouraged wearing masks as they are not useful for non-healthcare workers. Masks, they do not protect against viruses. Masks do more harm than good, especially for children. Viruses are transmitted through respiratory droplets when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. Large respiratory droplets are greater than 5 microns, and small aerosolized droplets are less than 5 microns. SARS-CoV-2, which is a virus that causes COVID-19, is 0.125 microns. Scientific evidence supports that aerosols play a critical role in the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. According to the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, wearing masks other than N95 will not be effective at preventing SARS-CoV-2 transmission. Even OSHA does not recommend surgical masks to prevent inhalation of small airborne contaminants. According to a memo from the California Department of Education regarding clear guidelines for schools and wildfire smoke, it indicated masks have limitations. Surgical gauze masks provide no protection for smoke. N95 respirator masks are designed for professional use by trained adults and are not intended for children. Therefore, masks are not recommended for children by air quality districts and public health agencies. Carbon dioxide is present in the atmosphere at a level of approximately 400 parts per million. According to the US Department of Agriculture and OSHA, carbon dioxide becomes toxic at concentrations above 40,000 parts per million, but symptoms at 5,000 to 10,000 parts per million. 10,000 parts per million has been measured behind mask. Are you familiar with California Education Code Section 49005.8? It states an educational provider shall not use a physical restraint technique that obstructs a pupil's respiratory area or impairs the pupil's breathing or respiratory capacity. Masking our children not only puts them at risk for infection, but it causes psychological damage. Masks cause anxiety, sleep problems, behavioral disorders, and fear of contamination. Masks are a major threat to their development. The well-being of children is highly dependent on the emotional connection with others. Masks make school a threatening and unsafe environment where emotional connection becomes difficult. Masking our children for 6 hours a day is child abuse. If our children's health and safety is of utmost importance to you, please unmask our children. Nobody should be coerced into wearing an unapproved face mask. Here in America, we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Please protect freedom of choice and let our children breathe. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, 7B, communication from the audience regarding matters on the consent agenda are to be made at this time. This is an informational item.
Thank you. We are pausing for 1 minute to take requests to speak regarding matters in the consent section. If you would like to speak about matters in the consent section, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. We have less than 30 seconds remaining. If you'd like to make a request to speak regarding matters in the consent section, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit public comment card. President Ryan, we have no requests.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. And so with that, all right, consent section. May I have a motion?
I would like to make a motion to approve AA to AG.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Thank you, Mr. Kalaki. And with that, I'd like to take roll call. Mrs. Jack,
Aye.
Mrs. Chang,
Aye.
Mr. Chang,
Aye.
Mr. Kalaki,
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan, I, student board member. Thank you. Motion has passed for consent of the consent section. Communication section. This is a procedural item, communication from the Board of Education. Let's begin with Mr. Kalaki.
Board communication, you said? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in the last couple weeks since our last board meeting, I had the opportunity, I was invited by the high school water polo team boosters to attend the varsity water polo game at the high school against LaSalle. They did a phenomenal job with a resounding win. In addition, I had the opportunity to attend the South Pasadena game, or at least part of it, today at the high school. I did have a meeting with the acting superintendent as well. We discussed multiple issues. And then I did have multiple discussions with community members about the scope of what information is contained on the COVID dashboard regarding positive cases at our schools and for COVID, and relayed that information off to the administration so that they could be aware of what concerns there were with regard to the scope of information on the dashboard. And then also I had the opportunity to serve as a debate judge at the Jack Howe debate tournament, and was very impressed with the level of competition that our students compete in. And so I, again, just am always amazed at the level of skill that our students are showing and representing to the community and to other schools and teams and their professionalism. And just wanted to congratulate all the students that participate in those activities.
Thank you, Mr. Chang.
Just want to do one more time to congratulate Huntington Middle School get the blue ribbon. Yeah, the honor. I think this is a very rare opportunity because this year only one school from the California they get an honor. Secondly, Last Saturday, one more time, I also connect the South Pasadena, San Marino, Pasadena YMCA. So give the citizen for the flu, not the flu shot, for the COVID-19 vaccine. Yeah. So all the citizen they can do for Pfizer, Moderna, or the third shot for Pfizer. Yeah. Thank you.
I did a lot of random things this past couple of weeks. And there was a little bit of a theme with some legislative advocacy with a meeting with Senator Portantino. And he spoke on the focus on mental health, his focus in the state Senate with a focus on mental health and supporting students by looking at how we are excusing absences for mental health reasons, increasing training and for teachers and staff to recognize mental health, and providing more support for social emotional curriculum. He spoke as well about the legislature continuing to look at the future of independent studies and its impact on student learning. They're still working a lot of the kinks out, and it continues to evolve to meet student needs. There was talk of some of the ethnic studies that is being discussed at the legislature for 3-4 years now, and I think they're going to just keep discussing that and trying to figure out what that looks like. Also attended a LAXTA meeting in which they talked about the trusteeships that school districts will have to start wrestling with in elections, and Senator Leyva came and spoke and talked about some of the things that the legislature will be looking at, whether those are COVID related or perhaps ADA hold harmless policies that they might be evaluating. I went to the city council meeting last week. They talked about a number of things, grad night, housing element, things that sort of affect us on the periphery. And they also hired a DEI facilitator consultant. And I think that San Marino Unified might want to start thinking about how we play a part in that so that we are all on the same page in our city in productive and respectful conversations. I listened in on the Partnership for Awareness speaker with Jonathan Singer, and where he just reiterated the importance of keeping vigilant to protect our children and the role that we as a school would play in that goal. A couple other things on the fun side was a city club meeting but with photographer and BA Hall of Famer Andrew Bernstein, who is a San Marino resident. He talked a lot about moxie and dedication to his craft. And if you're into sports or photography, I would highly recommend going to sanmarinocityclub.org and looking at that video, because he goes through these amazing videos. One of them was, I believe it was Shaq standing on plexiglass above him as he was getting a shot. And he said Shaq thought it was really funny to keep jumping up and down on the plexiglass while he's under it. Other activities I've been going to are the picnic, the football game, PTA meetings, principal coffees, and it's been just amazing to reconnect with each other on multiple levels and multiple formats in ways that people feel most comfortable. And I think that's important, that we make sure that everybody has an opportunity to re-engage as we re-enter society. And on that note, I wanted to thank the teachers and staff everywhere with our school sites in our district, because I feel the weight of the mid-semester hump falling upon all of us. And I think the weariness is starting to show. My daughter said, I need a break. And I said, that's what the weekends are for. And she said, no, I need a break. I mean, and I think people are feeling a little bit tired, a little bit run down. But I want to thank everyone as they're working through our new reality. With patience and dedication, both as a student, as a parent, as a volunteer, as a staff worker. I'm very humbled and grateful, because we're all trying to figure out the pace that works. We went from 0 to 60 in no time flat, and I think it's been trying. And so I just want everyone feel encouraged to really take care of themselves first, so that they can be healthy. And in the course of that, if they are able to help others, great. But I really do want to encourage everyone to make sure that they're being mindful of themselves and their own mental health and self-care.
Thank you. Mrs. Jack?
Mr. Chang, Mrs. Chan, and I participated in a PCC sponsored event by Sandra Lau, who is a parent in our district, as well as a PCC trustee. And that was a conversation with Senator Portantino. It was along with South Pasadena board members, as well as La Cañada board members, as well as Pasadena Unified board members. So we had a lot of discussions about COVID, independent study, and the various bills that Senator Portantino wanted to try and pass and has been unable to pass. That was a very worthwhile, I thought, meeting for about an hour and a half. And he did ask where his friend Shelley was, and I believe he was referring to you, President Ryan.
Thank you, Mrs. Jack. A lot of my fellow board members have already reported on some of the activities that I participated in. One of the ones that was on September 16th was Mr. Chang and I met. It's a monthly meeting that we have with City Council, and we met with Mayor Ken Udi and school board representative liaison, Mr. Steve Tolt, and we discussed a number of things relating to COVID vaccinations and testing. And we talked at length about the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece that the city is going to be looking for volunteers to sit on this committee and represent. And they're going to be calling on many of you guys probably. They want representative from the various different organizations within our community. I also concur with Ms. Chung that the City Club meeting, the first time we are back in person for City Club dinner and guest speaker with Andrew Bernstein, and that was fabulous. And I know it's up on their website, right, Stephen? Okay, so Stephen's our head technology there too. So in any case, check it out if you want to see the recording of it. But also, I think what everybody has kind of mentioned on the board, maybe even peripherally, is that we are so very fortunate to be living here, to have the opportunities that we have, and in terms of reminding everyone for self-care, but also reconnecting with each other in the community. And that's very important. So with that, I think I'm going to call on our superintendent, Dr. Linda D'Artolari.
Thank you so much, President Ryan. I would just like to take this opportunity to offer a very hearty congratulations to Huntington Middle School for earning the national. And as Mr. Chang alluded to, they are the only middle school in the state of California to have this recognition bestowed upon them. And one of 45 districts in the nation to receive the National Blue Ribbon Award. That is absolutely incredible. And we are so very proud of the administration, the staff, the students, and the parents who helped make Huntington the wonderful school that it is. So congratulations to Huntington. We look forward to celebrating that a little bit more. We will send the principal and the teacher who helped write the application for that to Washington to receive the award. They will be coming back to the board and presenting you with a video documenting the trip, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch that. I also wanted to just acknowledge Partnership for Awareness. That's an organization that has been around in our community for a very, very long time. And they provide a very valuable service, I think, to the community and especially to the school district in helping
really bring awareness around a lot of topics that are very beneficial for our parents. And as Mrs. Chong alluded to, I will also participated in the Partnership for Awareness session with Dr. Jonathan Singer on student suicide prevention, which I think is a big topic. And it was presented in a very understandable manner in layman's terms, and really was just a wonderful eye-opening message that is very positive and timely for us in our community. And I also wanted to say thank you to our teachers and our staff, our administration, and our wonderful consultant sitting over there, Mrs. Pearl Azuka, who has been just amazing in getting all of the work done. We have just had so much accountability reporting that is tied to a lot of the COVID-19 information and resources that we have been given. So that's added a whole nother layer on our staff. I know that our teachers in the classrooms are working very hard to ensure that every student receives just an outstanding educational experience, whether they're in the classroom or enrolled in independent study. We have 3 independent study teachers who have been working tirelessly to make connections with those students enrolled, and they're just doing an outstanding job. So I would like to congratulate them. And that's it for me.
Thank you. Next, communication from student board member.
Nothing much happened at school besides our fall spirit assembly, it went over with almost no complications at all. One really nice thing was to see all performing groups out there again, like band, drumline, color guard, cheer, and all of them. They're really talented students, and I'm glad the school got to see them all again.
Thank you. All right, communication from the audience regarding matters on the information agenda are to be made at this time. This is an information item. Dr. Choi.
Thank you, President Ryan. Can you go ahead and allow attendees to raise their hand, and we'll pause for 1 minute. So we are pausing for 1 minute to take requests to speak regarding information items on the agenda. If you would like to make a request, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. Thirty seconds remaining. If you'd like to make a request, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. President Ryan, we have no requests.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. Next, we have communication from, the audience regarding matters that are on the agenda, right? Yeah, we're on the information are to be made. Okay, that was done. Informational items, student growth model. Dr. Lina Richter.
Thank you, President Ryan, members of the board, Superintendent Delatorre, executive team. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting to the board a brief overview of the new California student growth model. The purpose of this presentation is, as I mentioned, a brief history of how the California student growth model came about, highlight the description and intent of the student growth model that was recently released, as well as share next steps for San Marino Unified School District. So the history of the student growth model started way back in 2015. California began this work in collaboration with stakeholders, including the State Board of Education, the California Department of Education, as well as Educational Testing Services, who is instrumental in developing and overseeing all of our state assessments. The work started because they were looking for a new method of monitoring student progress that was fair and equitable. And so in May 2021, recently, the state board approved the growth model. Now, it's important to note that because this work started in 2015, the intent was to have current data that could be actionable. However, we did not anticipate 2020 coming about. And so that put a pause in the ability to have current and actionable data. So all the data that is included in this student growth model is for informational purposes only. It is absolutely not intended to be for accountability purposes or to share with the public. So what is the student growth model? The student growth model is another way that another method California has developed to measure students' growth between the current year assessment scores and the prior year assessment scores. And the scores come about in two ways: individual growth scores, as well as aggregate growth scores. The individual growth scores look at the difference between the student's expected test score and their actual score. Now, the individual growth scores are instrumental in developing and calculating the aggregate growth scores, which provide a picture for the average growth for students within the school district, the school, or within student groups. Now, what is a growth score? How is that calculated? And I'll get to that in the next couple of slides. So again, there are two growth scores: individual growth scores and aggregate growth scores. So why did California develop a growth model? Again, to find a fair, equitable way to measure student learning. We talk about triangulation of data. This provides yet another tool to measure student progress. And it also provides a way not only to identify where districts and student group strengths are, but also a way to identify where improvement may be needed. And it also allows school districts to see how growth varies among various student groups. So how does the student growth model calculate the actual growth scores? For the individual growth score, the first step would be that you have to determine what the expected test score is. How is that done? Then you have to calculate the difference between their expected score and the actual test score. So what they look at is the students' current test scores in ELA and math and what they scored in the prior year. And that's how they determine the student's growth score for the next year. So what does the growth score show? It shows what the student was expected to show as far as growth minus their actual score or their growth. And that is their actual growth. For aggregate growth score, they use the individual growth scores and they calculate all of those to come up with the aggregated score. And that a simple or a weighted average is applied when calculating the aggregate scores. A simple average is usually applied when there are 500 or less students, and an aggregate weighted average is applied when there are 500 or more students. So which grade levels are growth scores calculated for? Because you need 2 or more years of test scores, growth scores are only available for students in grades 4 through 8. Grades 3 and 11 do not have growth scores because there are no prior year test scores. So remember that they do need a current year test score and a prior year test score. So therefore, high school students will not receive growth scores because high school students test in ELA and math on the state assessment only in grade 11. So last week on September 22nd, the aggregate growth scores were released at the district level. Those are released via the California Department website, and it's released in an Excel spreadsheet that is void of any student identifier. Individual student scores are not released, nor are they to be shared. The reason this data is historical and not intended for actionable data or for accountability purposes is because it is previous data. It is old data from 2016-17, 17-18, and 18-19. Again, when the work on the growth model first began, it was intended to be actionable, but with the suspension of Casp testing in 2020, and the flexibility districts had in 2021, we're using it only for informational purposes. The next release of growth scores is anticipated to be in 2024, when we will have, hopefully fingers crossed, 3 consecutive years of test scores. At that point, the data that will result from the new growth scores will be actionable. And those scores will be looking at smarter, balanced, summative assessments in ELA and math for 2021, 22-23, and 23-24. So what does this mean for us, for San Marino Unified School District? So the intent of publishing this data now, even though it's only for informational purposes, is to allow school districts to increase their understanding of the trends that they see in the data and how we can look at that data and identify areas where growth may need to be made or areas of strength. And again, this is only informational data. Provide student growth model resources on the district website so parents have an understanding of what it is and what it's intended for. And then evaluate how the aggregated growth scores compare to other Casp measures, such as looking how students score on the aggregated growth scores compared to how they score on Casp, the distance from standard, both in ELA and in math. So really analyzing the correlation between the two to better understand student growth. Analyze 2021 California school dashboard data that will be released in November of this year. That data will be actionable. The state has not decided how the Casp assessments will be reflected on the dashboard. It may be included under additional reports on the California school dashboard. And then lastly, between now and 2024, really analyze the data and consider what information would be helpful and instrumental when communicating the aggregated growth scores to our community, because that data will be actionable. And that is the end of my presentation. And I will answer any questions that you may have.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
You talk about, the individual growth score being the calculation between the difference between the student's expected test score and their actual test score, right? And step one, though, is determining the student's expected test score. But how do you determine the student's expected test score?
So there is a calculation. They look at the student's current, let's say ELA and math score, and look at how student groups, and then they look at how those students scored in the prior year. And then there's a calculation that is done through the computer that then determines their expected score for the next year.
So when you say it's done by a computer, so it's not done by us, it
No.
is based on whatever the state decides is the data that they're going to use.
That is correct.
And is it based on ethnicity? Is it based on?
That's an excellent question. It is not based on ethnicity. They did not disaggregate the data based on ethnicity or student groups because they wanted to see the aggregated data as a whole and then be able to disaggregate it after we have the aggregate scores to see how some students groups did compared to others.
So again, I'm just asking what the formula is. Is it, for example, that, at this age group last year in terms of, the San Marino students, that there was a 5% increase from the year before. And so that's how they determined the, another 5% increase. I guess what I'm asking is what is the formula?
There is no formula, and the formula is not predictable because it's based on how students perform currently, because every year they're going to perform at different levels, and how they performed last year, because that would dictate their expected growth for the following year. So it would change every year. And I don't know the exact formula, that was not shared with us during the informational webinars, but it is calculated through the computer that the state uses.
Just address individual growth score again. So once we compare, and then is that if some of the students they are behind, is that the principal they may talk to those students and give them a plan how to improve? So
the release of the scores are only the aggregate scores. Individual student data is not released, nor will it be shared with anyone. The spreadsheet with the data that's on the CDE website is not by individual students, it's aggregate scores, which includes all the district as a whole. And again, there's no identifiable student data, so we don't know who is who. It is for informational purposes. In 2024, when the growth model is released again, I'm not sure how that will be released, if they will release individual growth data, but at this point, that data is not available. Because again, it's for informational purposes only, and it's from 2016, 17, 17, 18, and 18, 19.
How about Dr. Choi? Is that we have a Casp report for the score this year or no?
There are some score reports. However, because the Casp testing, it was almost as if it were like a best effort. We don't have full conclusive results for every student. So I think we have to wait until the state releases more details about the results, but we don't have all the results.
So,
Add something
yes.
to that.
so we are expecting what, the November or December?
Maybe Dr. Richter can shed some light on the timing.
Thank you. The state published the completed student data file for the Casp assessments yesterday, September 28th. So that data is available to coordinators, testing coordinators. I did take a look at it. It does require a lot of disaggregation and comparing, putting the students together for ELA and math, separating it by school. So I haven't had a chance to do that. It was released yesterday. But again, as Dr. Choi said, because there was flexibility in testing this past year, and a lot of it was done virtually, we do have to take that data with a grain of salt, but it still does provide us a benchmark for the school year.
Anyone else have any?
So when we're talking about the aggregated growth score, it says simple or weighted average for a district, a school, or a student group. So I understand district, I understand school, but how do we define the term student group? Student by grade? Is it by, what is it?
I'm sorry. Yeah, student group would be by grade. It would be by ethnicity. It would be all of the student groups, the significant student groups that we identify when we look at our Casp scores.
Have some questions. Mike, did you?
I just had a quick question with regard to the Casp scores. Are they going to be releasing those individual reports for each child? So
Yes.
Okay, and any estimate as to when those will be released?
Absolutely. Those scores are currently available for all parents in the parent portal.
Okay.
So parents can as of today, go in there, as of a few days ago, actually, go in and pull and see their child's performance on the Casp assessments.
So those just became available?
They became available a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
thank you.
You're welcome.
So, sorry, I'm trying to figure out what we already asked here. So I was curious as to, I know that we're looking at other assessments for learning loss mitigation. How is this data, is any of the data from Casp or any of that going to be useful in that regard?
I think it will. Again, I think it needs to be taken with a grain of salt because we didn't have all our students test. The testing was done virtually. And so we do have to leave a little room for, I don't mean not error, but just a little room to take into consideration. But we look at all data when we're looking at student growth. And that's why the student growth model provides yet another layer to really triangulate the data. So we look at formative assessments, we look at state assessments, we look at formal assessments and informal assessments in the classroom, unit tests, all of that look together to see how our students are performing. However, the Casp assessments, which is a standardized assessment, really provides us a strong picture of how students did from last year to this year because it's the norm standardized assessment.
Okay, so then on that note, are we looking at the students longitudinally? Or are we looking at them merely like as a cohort? Are we looking at all of those things in addition to individual and district-wide and student groups?
Typically, when we look at student data, we do look at it as like cohorts longitudinally because we want to see how students do from one grade level to the next. You have to take into consideration students move. You're not looking at the same group. Sometimes you're comparing apples and oranges. However, the intent of the growth model is to do just that, to provide that longitudinal data. I think that's key. And we always do that when we look at the Casp assessment scores. We always look at how students do from one year to the next year. knowing that there may be some students who have moved or newly arrived students, but it does give us a good picture of how students are performing from one grade level to the next. Standards will be different, of course, from one grade level to the next, but our expectation is that they will continue to demonstrate progress on those assessments.
Okay. And then can you just clarify what you mean by actionable versus informational for those of us who are not ed speak?
Right. So actionable means we can share that data with our public. We can share it with our teachers. We can share it with our parents, just like we share the Casp assessment data with our community. It also means that we are not, if it's actionable, that means we could be held to a different accountability level, such as the comprehensive improvement plans that the state puts out when students are not performing at certain levels in ELA or in math. So we're not held to those accountability ties with this data because it's informational, it's not actionable. It's there, the true intent is really to put it out so school districts can analyze the data, look at possible trends, see how students are performing from one year to the next, and think about as we move forward, how that data is going to be instrumental for us as a school district to really monitor progress and monitor areas of strength and areas where needed growth is required.
And then my last one is a little bit more of an open-ended question that you may or may not know the answer to, but if you have any inkling of where the state is leaning. So I'm looking at the fact that our growth scores are really going to only be available for grades 4 through 8. And I know that our 11th grade students take them as well. And then they started taking the Casp science ones in 12th grade. But tell me, what is it the state plans on doing with that 11th grade data? And how is that related to some of the movement behind replacing the SATs or other standardized tests that students are already taking? Although now that the SATs are no longer really being used by the UC system either. I mean, is there any talk of what we're looking at in terms of why 11th graders are taking it and how we're supposed to be using and what we're going to be doing with that data?
Right, and you're absolutely correct. That is an open-ended question, and it's a question that we have been asking the state for years because we know that why are our students tested all the way to 8th grade and at 9th grade they're not tested, and then 2 years later they're tested in 11th grade, right? That is a state decision. That data for students in 11th grade, we don't see their data till they're a senior, till they're in 12th grade. At that point, we use it internally to be able to monitor student progress, provide supports if students need it, or really show how students are doing from one year to the next. But again, you're looking at 2 different sets of students, right, from 11th grade. So it would really be valuable if we could have that data in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade as well, because they only have 1 more year than when they're with us as a senior, right? And so there really is not a solid or justifiable answer that we've been given. It's the way it's been for years, and it's been questioned for years.
And is there any more talk of what to do about some of the movement to replace the 11th grade state testing with something like the SAT? But I know that's also moot because of the SAT's viability. I'm just trying to get a sense of what we're looking at.
Right. There has not been very much talk about that. One thing we are doing internally as a district is looking at how we can provide a universal tool or assessment at the secondary level to kind of fill that gap, right? Because we want to be able to monitor student progress in 9th grade and 10th grade, as well as 11th and 12th. And so what can we do as a district, possibly looking at a diagnostic assessment, a universal screener that would provide us consistent longitudinal data as students matriculate through the grade levels, not only middle school, but through high school as well. Because we don't want to stop when they're in high school and say, okay, well, we don't have any actionable data or any statewide data to use. We want something that we can really put our finger on so that we can continue to monitor student progress and make sure our students are successful.
So, and then thereby making the 11th grade data actually useful at that point.
Could be, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? So Lena or Dr. Richter, how is the student growth model different or the same as the SIPSA, the single plan for student achievement, when we're looking at that?
So the single plan for student achievement really outlines the goals that, sorry, someone's, the SIPSA outlines all the goals that are specific to that school site. It's a single plan for student achievement. And within that single plan, you have data that we used from internal assessments, from statewide assessments, or any other type of benchmarks that schools are using to be able to set goals and then set actions to reach those goals. So the SIPSA, in essence, is a school site LCAP, whereas the student growth model is showing data from one year to the next that you can incorporate into your single plan for student achievement to set your goals and your actions to reach those goals.
Okay, so if right now the data is not actionable, and then it will become actionable, what are teachers using right now to align the goals and resources in terms of intervention support?
As far as data,
Mhm.
so the teachers have a wide range of assessments that they are using. Many of them I presented, I believe it was our last board meeting, that they're using. They could be formal assessments as well as informal assessments. They could be end of unit tests. They could be programs that the schools have purchased for early literacy, for math, reading comprehension, all of those end of unit tests, end of theme tests, all of those that they could use in the classroom and continue to use, as well as the Casp interim assessments that many of our teachers use.
Okay, so they're uniform and across the board and it's school-wide?
They are
Only
not,
specific,
they're not 100% uniform. We're moving towards that direction to bring uniformity and consistency so that we are able to monitor student progress and provide longitudinal data to which to gauge student progress and provide interventions and supports and multi-tiered systems of support as our students progress. That longitudinal data is going to be key.
Mhm. And so with the student growth data, it measures or looks at data academically, right? Is there a component of the social emotional learning or growth?
No, the student growth model only assesses ELA and math on the Casp assessments.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. All right, next, Dr. Choi, communication from the audience regarding matters on the action agenda, and they are to be made at this time.
Thank you, President Ryan. We're pausing again for 1 minute to take requests to speak on action items on the agenda. If you would like to make a request to speak, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. Thirty seconds remaining. If you'd like to make a request, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit the public comment card. President Ryan, we have no requests.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Next action item, this is review of 2021-22 goals and corresponding budget priorities. This is a presentation, Dr. Linda Delatorre and Ms. Pearl Izuka.
Thank you so much, President Ryan, members of the Board of Education, student board member, and executive team. This evening, as President Ryan mentioned, we're going to be reviewing the board goals and providing the Board of Education with additional information on our budget for the 2021-22 school year. Ms. Izuka and I will be co-presenting. I am going to take you through the first portion of this presentation, which is a review of the goals that the board developed on July 30th during a board retreat that was facilitated by CSBA consultant, Ms. Pride. So let's go ahead and take a look at the topics that we're going to cover during this presentation. We will review the board goals for 21-22. We're going to discuss enrollment. And as the board is aware, we are declining in enrollment, and that trend is predicted to continue through at least 2028. We're going to talk about multi-year projection of unrestricted revenues, expenditures, surplus deficit spending summary. We're going to provide you with ending balance allocations. We're going to talk about the certificate of participation, which is a funding vehicle that we used to support the Barth Athletics Complex. And then we're going to be talking about parcel taxes and the school's foundation, our local revenue sources, and then we will discuss COVID. We're going to review the funding allocation and expenditures to the current period. And then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. So I'd just like to review the 4 main goals that the Board of Education came up with on July 30th during the board retreat. And they were in 4 categories. And the first was financial, and that was to implement a plan for long-term fiscal health. The second was social emotional wellness. And by the way, I'd just like to say that these are not in order of importance. They're in no particular order whatsoever. So I just want to make that clear. So the second goal is social emotional wellness, support the physical, social, and emotional well-being of students and staff. The third goal is learning regression mitigation. Address learning, regression, and variability. And then we have learning and growth, provide impactful professional development to improve student experiences. So those are the 4 main goals that the board came up with for 2021-22. So I'm going to take you through each of these, and I'm going to talk with the board a little bit about some of the objectives and strategies that staff has used to work toward achieving each of these goals. I'd also like to just state that we did have an administrative strategic planning session wherein we took the 4 main goals that the board developed on July 30th, and we developed our own administrative goals that tie into the larger and broader board goals. And so we're going to provide you with a little bit of evidence that we have done considerable work toward meeting these goals already. So the first goal, financial, is to implement a plan for long-term fiscal health. So we have, we're going to take a look at the COP payments and making sure that we can budget for them appropriately in the out years. And then the board could consider an early payoff without penalty, if that's something that the board wants to look at. I think the thinking originally when the Barth Athletics Complex was built was that we were going to pass a bond and then turn around and pay off the COP balance. And as the board is aware, we did go out for Measure S and it did not pass. So we have been needing to account for the COP payments. And these payments are made annually in one lump sum. We also are looking at increasing our reserves and creating a fiscal sustainability or stabilization fund. And this money can help us bridge the gap between our revenues and our expenditures. We could also look at passing a bond in the near future. I know that there have been many community members who have come forward who have expressed an appetite for moving forward with a bond. That is a decision that the Board of Education will need to make. And in order for us to do that, staff is going out for a facilities needs assessment and a facilities master plan. These 2 documents are going to be instrumental in guiding the board's thinking about the need for a bond, and would be very helpful if the board were to reconvene a facilities advisory committee. These 2 documents would prove invaluable for them to go through the process of evaluating how much we would need in order to meet our goals. And then one thing that we need to do for long-term fiscal health is to continuously ensure that we have a staffing plan that is commensurate with our enrollment. So when we're declining in enrollment, we need to make sure that we're not overstaffed. And then if we increase in enrollment, we may need to hire teachers. So that could work either way. But we just want to make sure that the board is aware that we will need to continuously look at our staffing plans and make adjustments that are necessary depending on enrollment. The second goal is social emotional wellness, support the physical, social, and emotional well-being of students and staff. So here are some of the objectives and strategies. We are using expanded learning opportunity grant funds to develop a comprehensive plan to support the physical, social, and emotional well-being of students and staff. So there you see we are using some of the COVID funds to support this initiative. We are also planning to expand the wellness coordinator's role in supporting students who are in school here, TK through 12, and also including our independent study students. And we're going to provide counseling support at the San Marino High School Wellness Center, which is already being supported by the wellness coordinator and interns. University interns are being used to staff actually both the current wellness center and the new wellness center, which we hope to open, I believe, by December. That's the goal. And that's going to be at the Huntington Middle School in the former Teachers Lounge. So they're working to create a very safe space for students to be able to receive some support from intern MFTs. And then we want to and are already expanding opportunities for mindfulness training throughout the district. One thing that we would like to do to support the physical health of all of our students is to ensure that all of our education courses include curriculum on nutrition and healthy lifestyles. And we believe that our physical education teachers do include that as part of their curriculum. And we want to make sure that we're enhancing all of our employees' awareness of our employees assistance program. We do have a very valuable free program for all of our staff, but I'm just not sure how aware they are of this until they need it. But it would be good for them to just call on that program for a variety of different things. We also have Care Solace, which is a program that we have had for the past few years, which helps to coordinate mental health programs if there's a need for inpatient services. Care Solace is invaluable in order to coordinate that care. And the next goal is learning regression mitigation, assess and address learning regression and variability. So here are some of the objectives and strategies that we're using to meet these goals. And we are using expanded learning opportunity grant money for a universal screener review committee to select and to purchase a diagnostic tool and instructional pathway in order to assess and address learner variability from remediation to enrichment for the elementary. We're also currently providing after-school academic intervention opportunities. An example of that is the Huntington Middle School Homework Club, where we have certificated, fully credentialed teachers providing support to students who come after school, and we are using some of the COVID funds to support that as well. We are doing the same thing with the secondary, commencing with the second semester of this year in terms of establishing a committee to look at universal screeners to assess and address learning regression. We are engaging in progress monitoring, and this is being done formally and informally. And then last but not least, we have professional development. Provide impactful professional development to teachers and staff to improve student experiences. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about the 2 days of professional development that have already taken place. One of the days was incorporated into the teacher's calendar for professional development, and that was a menu of options for teachers. They could participate in a variety of different trainings, including training on ELD, special education, instructional technology, social emotional learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then again, we used COVID expanded learning opportunity grant funds to support that. We also had a 1-day optional teacher professional development day. And that was actually very well attended, if I'm not mistaken. which was a very positive thing for the district. And that was primarily on ELD, instructional technology, and special education. Or it was on, the mandatory one was student-centered innovation, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. So then we had received a 2-year grant from LACO to support universal design for learning training. And this was very important to the school district, since we have made a commitment to ensure that every single teacher is trained in UDL. And then we're going to continue to provide PBIS training. And we are currently in the second of the 3rd year, and we're going to start secondary next year. And we're going to continue our annual training on mandatory things such as child abuse reporting, student suicide prevention, sexual harassment, and that is done through a portal through Target Solutions. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Azuka to talk to you about enrollment and the budget.
Good evening, President Ryan, members of the board, executive cabinet, and members of the public. So tonight we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the budget for this year. We have, as the programs you just heard with your board goals have been incorporated into this year's budget. So I'm going to be more or less focusing on the one goal of the long-term health, of fiscal health of the district. So we start with enrollment, and I want to mention that we have assumptions that we make when we build our budget. So if the enrollment changes, obviously, then our budget would need to change accordingly. So it's always when we adopt our budget, we give you the parameters in which we developed it so that if anything changes, we can point to the reason why it's different. So this is the assumptions that we have made. And this slide actually has a lot of information about how schools are funded. So if we look at the current year, our current enrollment is 2710. But we are actually being funded on 2847. And that is because we were held harmless because of the COVID situation for 2 years. And so we are getting a lot more funding than we actually have students for. And then when we talk about the funding cliff, this is what we're referring to, because next year we're going to true up to what we really have. And so we've done a great job of preparing for that. And we will continue to do a good job of preparing for what's happening. So we can see that next year we are projecting a continual loss at 2645. If more come, that's great, but we have to plan on our history and determine what is best for in terms of the funding and making sure that we fund accordingly. We can always adjust up if we have to. If we looked at 21-22, we should be funded at 2642 per student. I mean, that's the ADA that we should be using. But because we're being held harmless, we're actually being funded at 2847. But next year, when we look at funding, you get to pick the higher of the 2 years. And so because we have a drop, that actually next year funding should be 2581. But because we're able to use the higher of last year or this year or the year you're in, we're going to use what we should have gotten this year. So next year's funding is going to be 2642. And that's obviously 200 students or 288 difference. That's going to make a difference. And look at the change. We went from having a surplus of 1.3 or additional 1.3 to next year, we're going to actually have 1.4 less in money. This is millions we're talking about here. Again, the enrollment is important because that's how we staff, but we're actually funded on ADA, and that's average to daily attendance. So we'd like it if every student came every day and with, was there, we would be funded at the enrollment. But because students are absent, we only get to count when they're actually in school. So that's why there's a difference. And so we staff at the enrollment, but we get funded at the actual number of kids who actually are in school. The following year, we are getting the higher of 22-23 or 23-24. And so we're actually going to be funded at 25-81. This is very conservative. This is probably a little optimistic because you see, we actually are saying we're going to flatten, but we actually might drop. And so that's an assumption. We'll continue to evaluate that. And as we look at years out, we'll then adjust that accordingly. But that's the assumption we're making right now. Oop. Now, this is an interesting slide to see exactly where we're actually losing our students. So we just put in for funding purposes for 1920, what our enrollment was like by grade level. And you can see that if you compare it 1920 to this year, TK through 3 is pretty much the same. 4 through 6 is about the same. But you can see the big difference in 7th and 8th grade. There's about 50 students less there. And then look what happens in high school. We've lost, close to less than 200, but close. And so in an ideal situation, the graduating class that's coming out, the 12th graders, would be replaced by the same number of kindergartens the following year. But you can see that's not happening because, the 9 through 12 level is 870 and TK through 3 is 819. So we're actually not getting the loss replacement from the grades that less. And there's a bubble that's going through, and this is going to continue on. So when we're talking about getting the staffing according to what our enrollment, this is what we're referring to, that we should be sure that our staffing is based on staffing for those numbers in those grade levels. And we did start making reductions from 1920. And so we're slowly doing that. But as the enrollment continues to go down, we need to correspondingly make the changes as well. So when we look at the projection, this is all our basis for the assumptions for revenue. And so we're going to be taking a look for a couple years, this year and the next two, because this is what's required by the county when we file our first interim. We look at the current year +2, that how you can see the LCFF funding. Now that's where the ADA funding is, okay, the average daily attendance. Again, that's an amount that's calculated, number of ADA times the LCFF rate. And then you get a total number. In this case, it's 26 million. And we first fill that with local property taxes. And whatever the difference that we don't get to 26 or 25 million, then the state backfills the difference. So that's how that particular funding is. And as you can see, that's the majority of our funding. So a lot of school districts have different levels of funding based on their economic needs of their community, based on the demographics of their area. But we are in a situation where this is pretty much the major source of our revenue, and it's not the same as some of our areas that are contiguous to our district. We're reliant a lot on the local revenue, which again is donations and our parcel tax. So this year, the 8 million includes the 2 parcel taxes as well as our donations that we're expecting from our partners. So you can see that as the years go on, in the next couple of years, our revenue is going down. So the expectation is that our expenses would, of course, be correspondingly the same, because we want to be in a situation where we're not having to dip into any savings for a long period of time, because sooner or later, you're going to run out of those savings, and then not good things happen to school districts when that happens. So here is just a brief overview of the different expenses that we've calculated for the next couple of years. And I just want to talk a little bit about the first three there. So we have included for the years out, step and column movements for any of our employees that's expected. We use a historical number that we expect to see. It's easy when people are moving down based on seniority. It's a little more difficult based on units taken because we have to see what historically people do in order to move over in their columns for the teachers. But we have included that in there. And then in the employee benefits, we did assume the higher rates or the rates that's given to us by school services for CalPERS and CalSTRS. We've also increased our health benefits. And we also remember that in this category, there are other benefits that are calculated on $1 per payroll. For example, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, Medicare, Social Security. All of those are based on the salaries, and then that's multiplied by a percentage. So that's all been included. Those three numbers make up over 80% of our budget. So we always say that when we're looking at our budget, we're a service organization, we are people, that unfortunately is really the area that will make the biggest difference when we have to make reductions is in our folks. So just to do a real quick overview, when we take our revenues and then subtract our expenses, we should be plus or at least zero. That whatever we're getting in revenue, we spend, and then that should be a goal. But you can see that in the next 2 years out, without making any reductions, because we didn't assume any reductions at all, because we're not quite there yet. But that you can see that in 22-23, we're actually in a deficit situation of 1.5, and then the following year, 2.7. Now, carrying that forward, we show what we're starting the year with. So we're starting this year, again, this is unrestricted only, not restricted funds. This is only restricted. We're starting this year with 8.9 million. Remember, we had a surplus of 1.3. We're projecting at this point ending at 10.2. Therefore, we start next year with 10.2. We now have a deficit of 1.5, and our ending balance is going down, it's 8.6. The following year, we start with 8.6, deficit of 2.7, and we end our ending balance is 5.9. This is what we are proposing for the board to consider for how we want to allocate those ending balances. For 21-22, 10.2 million, 22-23, 8.6, and 23, 5.9. You can see there all the different categories in which we're proposing for you to consider. The first one, of course, is required by the state of California that we must maintain at least a 3% reserve. So that's right off the top, we have to allocate that. And then we need to set aside revolving cash fund, our stores prepaid. And then we're proposing to set aside 2 million for cash flow purposes, or potentially for future ways to deal with parcel tax and donations. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. We've set aside future stabilization, again, to help us with not only declining enrollment, but potentially what will happen with our economy and not knowing what that's like, but we want to set that aside. We've also set aside 3 years of payments for the Barth project that we took out a loan for 6 million. And we'll talk a little more about that, but we've set aside that. And then we've also set aside 2.5 million in declining enrollment. And you can see that it's gone down over the years because we had those deficits in those years. So that took away from that 2.5. But even with that, we're still at the end of the 3 years, we're able to meet our 3% reserve. And we do have some cushion there, or some, I guess, some security, knowing we've got some things to cover us in the other areas if needed. So let's go into specific areas on those assignments. And let's talk about the COPs. COPs, Certificate of Participation. This was as Dr. Delatorre mentioned, it was a financing tool that was used in March of 2017 that we entered in. We borrowed 6.3 million, and the loan, it's an actual loan that we took out, but it has the title of Certificate of Participation, is from 2017 through 2041. And so as of June 30th, 2020, our auditors posted that we had 6.1 million left in principal. And we did fortunately have the foresight here. You have the foresight to enter an agreement that allows you to do a payoff. You just had to get past 2019, which we're more than there, so that we could pay off this liability without any penalty. So that is up for consideration as we've set aside 1.5 million in our assigned balances to take care of at least 3 years of payments there to get us going in case, or to prepare for maybe a potential bond. But at least we can start making payments towards that. The next area is in our parcel tax and San Marino Schools Foundation. Measure Z and Measure R. This year, we budgeted 4 million and for Measure E, and we budgeted 1.6 for Measure R. And maybe we want to think about having a contingency plan that we would set aside a reserve that will allow us, in case we need to make adjustments, that we have some time, we buy at least a year or so to allow for that adjustment, so it's not so sudden and erratic, that we can try to do it in a methodical way. Similarly, with the San Marino Schools Foundation, who's been such a great partner with the district, we have budgeted 2 million. And again, the thinking is perhaps we might want to think about setting aside a reserve also in case adjustments would be needed. And the last point of discussion is on the COVID-19. With you there at your table is a more detailed explanation of each one of the funds. In this presentation, I'm just giving you the summary of all the different kinds of funds that have been afforded to the district for COVID relief. And these pretty much on this first slide that I'm showing you, and I've included the actual names for which one, what they all stand for. There's so many letters in there, but each one of them has been out. And what this is set up is gives you the date in which we need to spend it, how much we are allocated, how much has been budgeted or spent, and what the balances are. So you can see pretty much that these are mostly state, from the state of California. We will have spent all of those dollars by the end of this year. On the next page is our federal funds, ESSER, which stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. You can see we had ESSER 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 2 is pretty much, it has been spent. ESSER 3 is still, we do have a balance there. And we're working on getting that plan together because we will be bringing that to the board next month for your approval to our plans for ESSER 3. And so in total, we received about $8 million in COVID funds. And we have a little bit, about 700,000 left for us to yet to spend. So with that, our next steps is we're going to continue to evaluate our enrollment. We'll be bringing you the first interim report in December, not that far away, a couple more months. And in January, we're going to be doing the audit. And in March, we'll be presenting you with the second interim. At the same time, we're going to start looking and planning for the budget for next year. We'll get the governor's budget in January. We're going to need to make some decisions on staffing. We'll bring that budget to you in June. And I think that we're on our way to starting to begin that new year. So with that, I'll take any of your questions.
For the future enrollment, I think the short term maybe continue to drop. But long term, if a supplemental governor new policy, they can do the ADU or the affordable housing. So maybe may increase some the student. I know this is probably a sensitive issue in the San Marino community, but if stay, they keep pushing. I think some of family may build a ADU and rent to someone that may help. Yeah. So I suggest, I think the administration probably also need to start to review about for the future policy, how they can study in the school district.
Mr. Pilecki? Ms. Chong?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. This is very comprehensive. I can see a lot of the work and thought went into this. So thank you, Dr. Delatorre and Mrs. Zuka. I had a couple of questions, and then I wanted to raise hopefully some comments for us to be able to have some conversation as a board around some of these assumptions. So I have one question on unrestricted ending balance projections. You have listed assigned declining enrollment. Sorry, I don't have a.
Yes.
Can you explain what those line items mean?
So for that one, we know that we're declining and we're losing revenue because of that. So this is actually sort of a reserve or a savings account. And keep in mind, it's only 1 year though, but that's just to help us so that we don't have to make drastic reductions in 1 year. So that's why you can see that in the slide there in 22-23, it's gone down because we use some of that because of the deficit that occurred in 22-23. And then it's totally gone in 23-24.
So that sort of corresponds to the enrollment, how we're funded by our ADA. And so the idea is to set aside those funds.
Right, and try to give us a soft landing
Okay.
so that we don't have to make all those reductions in 1 year.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Regarding the COP, and this may be a question you may or not, this might not be a question that you can answer. I
Okay.
recognize that. But when we talk about the COP and we talk about paying it off, what are our realistic options for that? So I see one of our options is using our ending balance monies.
Yes.
What are other options? I know we talked about a bond. Is there any other option that we as a district can realistically consider?
Other than using other donations, perhaps, that might be another, I mean, that actually, we were very grateful for the donation that was given that had paid the COP payments up until this last year. I really don't think there are too many because most of COPs are paid out of the general fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's really just what, and I am very grateful for that having been covered. Measure E and Measure R slide, we talked about you mentioned in the third bullet, future contingency plan. What does
Right.
that mean?
So in the assignments there, it's actually under cash flow, but that's, we set aside 2 million. In the past, it had been done for cash flow purposes, but we're suggesting now that we would divert it to, it's $2 million to cover at least some of this in case, we don't want to have another year like this last year where we weren't sure if we were going to be able to get it. So we started having to do all those unfortunate layoff notices and then we were able to reinstate.
At one point, we had talked about possibly building up a reserve that would equal the revenue that we receive from both Measure E and Measure R and the Schools Foundation's annual campaign of $2 million. And so it's our goal to try and build that up over time. We're not going to be able to do it overnight, but that's where you see on the unrestricted and balance projections, the assignment of the $2 million.
The cash flow.
We call it cash flow. That's Fund 17. We used to have a cash flow fund that helped us borrow money from ourselves when we were receiving deferrals from the state of California. So when the state was supposed to pay us in January, they wouldn't pay us until April. And so we had a little bit of a cash flow issue that we needed to address. So we had built this reserve up in Fund 17, where we would use that money, take it out of 17, and bring it over to the payroll account so that we could make payroll. And then we would pay ourselves back as opposed to having to use some other financing mechanism.
Those were like the trans that we
Right,
used to have to take
exactly.
out.
So we
Instead of a trans, we did it borrow from ourselves.
And then the philosophy changed to we need to spend today's dollars on today's students. And so we sort of spent that cash flow balance down over time. Because at one point there was 7 million in it and we spent it down to about 800,000. Is that right, Vanjie? 800,000? We were. Yeah, at one point we had like $7 million in the cash flow fund and we spin it down and then we're starting to build that back up. But when we went through that period of time where we had Measure E on the ballot in March and it did not pass, there were many community members who said, okay, district, what's your plan B? Well, our plan B for the future, and this is just a temporary bridge, is to have a cash flow fund that will allow us, at least that buffer, as Mrs. Zuka said, of 1 year to be able to plan very carefully the reductions that need to be made to account for that loss in revenue.
So, and just as a point of note, the reason we had that 7 million was because we had sold property. Not like we had gotten a lot of money from the state or anything like that.
Years ago, we did get some money from the federal government on ARA, but it wasn't that much. It was nothing compared to what we're receiving in COVID monies. But we built that Fund 17 up over a long period of time. And we spent it very quickly.
So this is that plan B that everybody
Yes.
was sort of
Yes.
alluding to.
Correct.
Okay, and then one last question was, you talked about the COVID funds and then you said $700,000 left to spend.
Right.
Are you saying that 700,000 left that hasn't been allocated?
We're going to be allocating
It's
it.
going to be
Yeah, we
allocated.
just haven't. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not as though we had 700
No.
loose change fall
Yeah.
out of the
Oh, no.
couch, right?
Yeah, no.
It's like, there are ways that we're
Right.
looking at actively spending it. We just haven't put it into the budget yet.
And we have till 2024 to spend it too. So no, it's not like we need to do it right away.
Right.
Although I think we probably could, but.
And one example, again, how we're spending this money on teachers, we have 3 independent study teachers that are going to be funded from COVID monies. That's a perfect use of this money. And then we also have intervention support programs where teachers are providing support after school, and we're paying them hourly, and that money is coming out of COVID funds as well.
Before I open cans of worms, if anyone else has questions.
I have more questions.
Can I'm sorry, you did? Or you
I
did
do,
not?
but you go ahead.
Just a very quick question on the issue of the teachers with the COVID money.
Mhm.
Does the COVID money that should or must be used for teachers also cover substitute teachers? Is there like special type of funding for that? And is there a way to, are we is there plans to most efficiently use?
I think we
Subs so
could
that we have them
charge
available.
the subs that are replacing the independent study
Yes.
teachers.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
that if it's a sub for a teacher that's involved with some special program, then
Mhm.
yes, we can pay for that. That's part of it.
But if it was a sub that was needed because some teacher, for whatever reason, would it have to be related to an absence related directly to COVID in order to then have that substitute be paid from the
Yes,
COVID?
Yeah.
money?
it needs to be in some way related to
Oh.
COVID.
We'll find a way.
Yeah.
We'll find a way.
Earl will find a way, yeah.
Go ahead, Mrs. Jack.
So, when we talked about, so in terms of, we talked about, Dr. Delatorre, you
Yes.
talked about, passing a bond and having a facilities need assessment, right, and a facility master plan. What is the cost for that? What are we talking about? Do
So
you have an idea?
it's my understanding that a facilities master plan is going to cost about $50,000. And a facilities needs assessment is probably going to be about 15 to 20.
Okay. And then. So Dr. Delatorre, you had said in terms of enrollment assumptions, right, that we are going to assume that there's going to be declining enrollment all the way to 2028. So then my question, I guess, is why on our enrollment assumptions, we have, 2021 is 2017, 22, 23, 26, 45, and then flatten out to 2023, 2024. Why is it flatten out when our assumption is that there's going to be declining enrollment?
Right, so we will probably need to make an adjustment on that number.
Mhm.
Yeah, what we did is we just looked at the history and how the cohorts are coming in and how they've moved down. And, but we probably will need to take a second
Yeah.
look at that.
I
for
asked that
third
same
year.
question. It's because of the way that the grade levels are rolling up. You take kindergarten.
I
from-
saw that.
Yeah.
Right
yeah.
on the next page,
Yeah.
but why is looking at that as well, if we're saying declining enrollment, right, regardless
Right.
of what
Mhm.
the grade level projections are, it doesn't really make any sense that it would flatten out if we're gonna say, but what you're saying is that you're gonna be taking a look at that
Yeah,
again.
absolutely.
And that'll be brought back to the board sooner rather than later, right? Because
course,
so
yes.
much of that
Yeah.
is what we need to
Mhm.
decide, right? How we're
Absolutely.
gonna spend our money, right? And what cuts need to be made. Okay, so, so now we're talking about the COP.
Yes,
So it says, as of June 30, 2020, the district has an outstanding liability of approximately 6.1 million, right?
Mhm.
So we're September of 2021.
right.
So what is our outstanding liability as of today?
Yeah, I don't want to give the number now because this was actually from the audit report. So we're doing our audit right now, but we'll come back to you and give you an estimate.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's
because
a
it's
year.
mostly interest.
Yeah.
So you're not going to see much decline. It's probably maybe 6 million. I mean,
Okay,
it's not-
so that
because
was going to be my next question. It
Mhm.
says the district has an outstanding liability of approximately $6.1 million as of June 30, 2020, right?
Right,
And that outstanding balance, we're talking about principal liability,
Only, right,
right? Not debt service.
correct.
Right.
So what is the debt service, right? So if we're looking only at the audit report, right, as of June 30, 2020.
Right.
What was the debt service as of June 30, 2020?
For till 41, till 41, it's 10 million.
So the debt service is 10 million as of June
Yeah.
30,
Total.
2020,
Mhm.
right? Okay, and so you'll also give us then the debt service, right, as of, if you're gonna give us the outstanding
Yes.
principal liability as of
Sure.
September, I'd like to know what the debt service is
Of
on
course.
that,
Mhm.
right?
Sure.
And then, and again, this may not be, exactly what, because, obviously the COP is costing us a lot of money, especially the debt service portion of it, right?
Right.
So in terms of whether or not this board does or doesn't go out for a bond and when it does or doesn't, I guess I'd like a little more information, not only in terms of the principal amount owed and the outstanding balance, the outstanding debt service on it,
Mhm.
but also what the scenarios would look like in terms of, right, if we did go out for a bond and if we paid it, obviously, we said as of 2019, we can pay off the whole amount without any liability, right?
Right.
Without any penalty. So I guess I'd like a little more information on that, right? And I understand this is a total overview and I understand now we're doing a deeper dive and I apologize for that, but this
Sure.
is a,
No, absolutely. We
Okay.
can get that to you.
so then now we go to summary of COVID funds and expenditures,
Okay.
right? So the caller had called in and said that there were 3 pots specifically for salaries. So when we look at this summary of COVID funds, which 3 pots are we talking about?
Angie, are you able to answer that? We were looking at that last week.
I think, well, for sure, in-person grant,
Right.
in-person instructional grant. And I believe the ESSER funds also can be used for salaries.
So is that ESSER 1, 2? You said ESSER 1 and 2, we've already,
Yeah,
right,
ESSER
used all
1
the
and
money.
2. Uh-huh.
so it would be ESSER 3?
ESSER 3, I don't know. I need to check on that. I'm not absolutely sure. But ESSER 1 for sure can be used for salaries.
But that's already been spent, right, or
Right.
budgeted?
Right,
So that's not available.
right. So either is the in-person grant. So,
Okay, so when we're talking about 3 pots specifically for salaries, right, 2 of the pots we have already utilized, right?
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yes, and I'd just like to speak to something very quickly, just to refresh the board's memory. The ESSER 2 monies were used initially, $485,000 was going to be transferred from the general fund into the food services cafeteria account because we went from earning revenue on lunch sales to providing free lunch and breakfast. And so the food service account was going to be deficit spending to the tune of $485,000. So we're going to bridge that gap. And then we found out that we could use the COVID monies for that. So we used that $485,000 out of ESSER 2 monies to the food services account. So that was used on staff salaries. I just want to point that out.
But
Is that-
SB
So ESSER
117.
2 can be used on salaries?
Yes, and
Uh,
SB 117 was used for food service salaries.
Okay. And then my last question is, when we're looking at expenditures, right, overall expenditures, just general ones, right? Obviously, our costs are increasing on a number of different levels, including, right, the free lunch program.
Mhm.
So when we look at that, and if we have to continue, right, to provide free lunches, right,
Mhm.
regardless, did the expenditures, what I'm trying to say is for those expenditures, did we look at, right, specific departments, for example, right, food services, and the potential increase, right, in terms of a steep increase, or was it like, for example, was it a 3% increase across the board in terms of expenditures across all departments? I mean, what was the assumption made in terms of expenditure increases through the years
For, I'm sorry,
for the district?
for the district?
So for example,
I'm a little confused. So on the salaries that we, the assumptions we made for the salaries for the next 3 years was taking a look at the history of step and column movements and adding that percentage to those
Right.
numbers.
No, I understand that. So for example, on unrestricted projected expenditures, right? We're looking at operating expenditures, right?
Correct.
And we have it as the first year, this year is 2.6, right?
2.6.
You have operating expenditures 2.6.
Okay, that's for like services.
Right, that's what I'm
supplies.
talking about, right? So that, did that include, for example, food services?
No, they have their own
Where
fund.
does that go?
Food services has their own separate fund. It's not part of the general.
Oh, okay.
Operating expenditures, would that be like utilities?
Yes, it's like electricity,
Yeah.
it's service contracts.
Right.
Those kinds of things. That's what that is.
So those are more, right, like facilities oriented or whatever. Is that correct?
Well, they're
or-
more they're the other expenses to operate a business.
Yeah.
Okay,
Basically.
so I guess my question is, so the operating expenditure of 2.6 million is probably based on what we spent, last year or whatever, right?
Correct.
There's got to be some
That's, yeah, based on
foundation, right?
history.
So then what was the assumption that the expenditures would go down in 2022, 23? Because we're not talking about, enrollment, declining enrollment, right? Equaling, right? To make sure that our expenditures also, are commensurate with the declining enrollment. I'm asking for operating expenditures. What was the assumption as to why the operating expenditures would go down by about 400,000?
Okay, that's a good question. And Vanjie, can you help us with that in terms of the?
Some expenditures for services that we weren't able to pay in 2021. So we carried it over the 2020 fiscal year.
Okay. So what, again, that's a one-time expenditure because it was a carryover from previous year that
We hadn't paid.
we hadn't paid and we're paying it this year. And we're assuming that won't exist in the years out.
So Vanjie, then 2020 to 2021, the actual expenditure without the carryover would have been about 2.2 again, right? Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. And it was an excellent report, I thought.
Thank you, Mrs. Chat. Just a couple of questions regarding say, for instance, books and supplies, you have there on unrestricted projected expenditures. Is that with an assumption that textbooks are going to cost less? We're going to electronic books, or why did that kind of go down?
I think it's the same response as
You
as
had
the
paid for
previous.
something.
There was, yeah. it's
Okay,
carryover.
carryover, okay. And then I was curious why facilities was not a direct anticipate, making the assumption that we're going to have facility needs, because we can't assume that we've got, or that we're going out for a bond. So then where is the assumption on the facility needs?
On the cost for facility costs are under operating expenditures. So, for example, the cost for contracting painting or doing, if we don't do it in-house, if we needed to contract with an electrician, they would all be under this operating expenditures.
So
so
these
all
are
of the-
some basic assumptions that we're making that we're gonna need
We-
annually.
Right. I think what we did is looked at history as to what we've been spending in the past and then budgeted those and for the future years.
Right.
Of course, if we find out we have a special need that we need to set aside dollars, we'll absolutely make the changes.
Okay, so thank you. And one
Mhm.
last question. So this question is for Dr. Choi. Dr. Choi, as we're looking at money for technology, and we've expanded our infrastructure, we've had teachers go to, everybody's on distance learning, now we're back on site. There was a discussion with independent study, and some parents were feeling like, what are we looking at? Are there ways in which we can incorporate distance learning? I know there's no funding right now for it because it's only for in-person or for independent study. Are we looking at our infrastructure to anticipate, because we cannot predict COVID-19, right? Are we looking at how we might need funding for that, because if we have to pivot again to distance learning, where is the line item for anticipating that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question in terms of preparing infrastructure and preparing technology for what may happen. And I think we've been very smart about investing in infrastructure. And we're also very smart in terms of paying for services that are cloud-based. So we pay for what we need. And I think it's very important to differentiate when we're investing in technology. What are the elements that would require something like infrastructure to lay the foundation? We invest in that. But then we also want to consider whenever we want to utilize new technologies, innovations, and not invest entirely. You don't want to build and invest too much in some emerging technology. So we want to remain flexible in that regard. So we take a very hybrid approach. We utilize infrastructure that's real, that's needed for foundational use, and then we invest strategically in other technologies by utilizing cloud technology. So things that we pay for when we need it, and then when we don't need it, we stop paying for it.
Okay, so that is also budgeted here?
Yeah,
Under
whatever
which-
we had as expenditures for this
A
year.
good example with that would be Zoom, for example. We're using Zoom now. And when we went distance learning, we invested and we purchased licenses for Zoom for all of our teachers. But as soon as we shifted back into in-person instruction, we stopped paying for those subscriptions. We no longer had to continue paying to use Zoom for our teachers because they're not doing distance learning. So that's one example of just being flexible with technology.
Mhm. Okay, but we're also anticipating, as we're looking at the students and what they will need, that we're still looking at programs and services and innovation to support student learning as we move forward, right? Because the demand on the student that's graduating in 2 years, 4 years is different than what we were anticipating before. So that's still being looked at.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to be flexible. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
That brought up a question for me. When we're talking about facilities and technology, one of the ways in which we kind of got lucky with the COVID money is that it came in and it allowed us to address our infrastructure. Are we building in some of those cushions at some point, and what are we anticipating at what point?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll need to look into that, but that's a good point. Absolutely.
I have one more question. For the unrestricted project expenditure equipment, each year we budget about 260,000. So can you tell what kind of equipment usually? I think this probably is other than the IT equipment, right?
It's mostly that, but Vanjie, would you be able to give us the details on what we spend equipment on?
One of the carts was vandalized, and we needed to fix that along with one of the gates. And so that would be an expense that's charged to equipment. If we have to replace any of the district vehicles, that would be charged, right, to equipment, things like that.
But IT too could,
IT could be charged to. equipment
depending
as
on the
well.
cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I have a small request that is mostly aimed at Dr. Richter. When we talk about professional development, I love that we're doing professional development again with our teachers. I love that we're able to use some of these funds in that way. Can we at some point have some reporting back on the impact that this professional development is having on the actual classroom instruction and student experience? Because I don't want us to be spending money that are not actually providing any useful benefit to our students or to our teachers. So at some point, I'm not sure what our evaluation is, but if we can just make sure to include that in future board meeting. Obviously not now because they just had it, but to kind of build that in at some point.
Absolutely, yes. And like you said, it will take a little bit of time, to make sure that the professional development is rolled out. We're supporting our teachers, we're providing coaching or support to our teachers. And then they're given the time to implement that in the classroom. We go in, do instructional walkthroughs, and be able to see that evidence of effective professional development. Absolutely, be happy to bring that back.
And then if we're done with questions, I'm going to open a big can of worms. So I think one of the predominant issues that we are hitting is this idea of spending today's dollars on today's kids versus spending tomorrow's dollars on today's kids versus not spending any of our dollars on anything. And I guess I'm wondering, as we're talking about facility needs assessment and possibly going out for a bond, as we're talking about staffing commensurate with our enrollment, and assuming, I'm going to say it because I know we all assume it, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that when we talk about staffing reductions, we're talking about staffing reductions based on our student needs and interests. It's not as though we are going to arbitrarily make decisions as a staff. And so, I want to say that because I think when we had to make cuts in the past, there was a lot of frustration about what the reasoning was behind it. And I think maybe we were not communicating clearly some of the rationales that go into it, because nobody wants to make those kinds of cuts. But you have to when you're looking at lower revenues, if we want to be responsible, if we want to not spend all of our money and be in a state of deficit spending for years and years and years to the point where we're irresponsible. So I guess my question to all of us on the board here is where we sort of see that line as we're looking at, do we spend money on paying off our Barth payment, or do we look at a bond? Do we look at our staffing and make reductions, or do we allow smaller class sizes to exist for a certain period of time? Where are we making cuts in programs? And how are we balancing that? So I don't know, I'm opening that up as kind of a discussion point for us as a board.
Can I just add something to that? We will always have smaller class sizes as compared to the neighboring districts, as long as we have parcel tax money to support that. So I just want to make that clear. So even if we're looking at right sizing or having a staffing plan that is commensurate with our enrollment, we are not going to make those decisions arbitrarily. We are not going to do that without an intense thought process. And we bring all the principals together and the assistant principals, and we look at enrollment, we look at, requirements, course requirements. It's a process that is very time consuming, and it is never, ever done just arbitrarily. So I just want to make that clear. But we will also place a very high priority on making sure that we're not, we're not increasing class sizes to a point where there's no difference between San Marino and neighboring communities, because we've made a commitment to the community that we will always have lower class sizes.
But I have to say, and I know this is the next line item in our agenda, but when I looked at the parcel tax and what we pay, our dollars don't go as far as they used
don't.
to.
You're right.
When I looked at how much we were funding 5 years ago compared to what we funded in our
Right.
report this year, we have less counselors, we have less support staff, whether it's administrative. I think that we had an administrative vice principal before, we had more like, we had other areas where and I think that we were smart. It's funny because I think some of our teaching areas increased because we tried to be really thoughtful in how we're spending the money. And so it wasn't necessarily a one teacher with 10 kids. So I think that was a really smart way of trying to be more efficient with our responsible with our money. But our parcel tax dollars don't go as far as they used to. And I know that the community spoke very clearly about how they felt about the parcel tax, but I don't know how I don't know. I'm opening that up as a discussion point again, because I just feel that we're being a little bit unrealistic sometimes when we think about how far our money is going to go.
And I think that's a really good question for you to pose. And I think that that's a big conversation.
mean, we're
It
not
is
gonna have it
likely,
now in
it's
5
likely going to
minutes?
be an ongoing conversation because it's very relevant. Everything that you just said is sort of an ongoing dilemma that this district is going to continue to have because of the way that we're funded by the state. I mean, 30% of our revenue comes from local resources, the 2 parcel taxes and our schools foundation. That is unlike any other school district in the state of California. We are very, very unique, and to use your term, a unicorn, right? I mean, we are with respect to how we're funded. So for us to be able to continue to provide the outstanding education that we do to students, we have to have the community's support unless we, at some point can qualify to be a basic aid district. But for now, it doesn't pencil out. So we, continue to rely on state funding and continue to rely on the generosity and support of our amazing community.
So I just want to make clear, because, and I'm so glad that you brought it up, and I'm going to take your very thoughtful questions in little bite-sized chunks. So first, with respect to the parcel tax money, right, it doesn't cover everything that it originally had before, but I want to be clear that has nothing to do with any administrative issues or, any issues at all. It just
Right.
has to do with increased costs. So,
Yes.
I just want to make sure that it's nothing to do with anything
Thank you.
other than a factual
Yeah.
assessment that, costs increase and
Right.
teacher salaries do as well.
Mhm.
With respect to your questions, which again, I think is something that we really need to consider. The first bite-sized one in terms of the bond, right? And I think that's a very, very good question, which is, one of the reasons I think we're all concerned about, right? The debt services as last year, $10 million a year. That's
Mhm.
a crap load of money.
Mhm.
So, but in order to address that, though, I think we would need to do a deep dive, right, about what the cost effectiveness is, what exactly our principal debt is, what our debt service is going to be, what point can we pay it off without, what's the cost? So I think that's a very valid question, but I think that's something that, we're going to have to take maybe even just, a board session and really do a deep dive, right? I think that's really true. In terms of the question, which I think is also very, very, very appropriate, is what do we do, right, as a board? What do we do as a district, right? Do we use our monies now? Do we use it later? Do we save it? Blah, blah. And I think every board has struggled with it. And sometimes, hindsight has been 20/20, and sometimes it hasn't been so great. But that, I think, is an ongoing discussion. But I think the importance of what you raise is that I think it's something we need to think about every decision we make, right? I think that's so important, because that's something I don't think we've really actually said. I think we've all thought about it, but we've never really, right? You kind of encapsulated the decision-making process that we have to go through, but I think it's kind of ongoing, and it's ongoing even today, I think. But for me, the answer would be I'd have to look at it situation by situation, with the thought of, what is it we're looking for with respect to that particular expenditure or that particular revenue item. So for me, I'd have to review it that way, but I would like to, and I think that's really good, that we look at through that lens. So that's my answer, mine.
By the way, so if you look at this projection, actually the COP is the big the major expense where eat up I think the curriculum or whatever. So I think the whole time as a school board member, because we are the small school district, so each board member, when they know the small school district financial situation, so they try to help. So that's the reason for last 30 years, they create a bond idea, bond and a 2 parcel tax idea. But this, unless you have other alternative solution, otherwise, this is only the 2 alternative will continue to serve the purpose to make up our finance. But in the meantime, if we cannot persuade the community, so then we lose the support. So every several years we have a hiccup. So then the same issue come out and scare the community, scare the teacher, scare the parent. But for a long term, I think to resolve the COP, unless we find a big donor, and then they need to give the big cash donation. Otherwise, we need to still need to create a bond, and whether it's a big one or a smaller one, we can discuss later. But not just the payoff for the past athletic, COP, because if you look at the operation expenditure, we have a different agent, the fiscal plan. So we routinely, I think annually, we still need to budget about the the maintenance. So that's the money. If we get approved from the citizen, then we get a bond, then we can replace those antique the equipment. Just like this time we use the COVID-19 money to pay for the air condition. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, Nam, your comments are good, and I think Jane has some very great questions that got to be answered that really need a lot of deep thought, and maybe not just sort of put answers out there right off the bat. And I don't think you're necessarily asking for that. Previously, before I was on the board, I co-chaired the campaign for the bond. I was very in favor of that bond because I understood the needs of the facilities and the real financial risks that these facilities pose to the district. One thing I really learned at the end of that campaign was it has to pass. And so when it has to pass, we need to really try to learn as much as we can from our community. And the only way that I think we can do that in creating a bond proposal is to go along with the suggestion that Dr. De La Torre had of reigniting the Facilities Advisory Committee. That was an excellent committee that did a lot of research, provided a lot of data, a lot of tangible information that then could inform the community of what the real needs are. As I have watched what's happened in this community over the past few years, the community has shown its willingness to support the district for a very long time. But its willingness is definitely present when it truly understands the need that is staring it right in the face. And I think that that's why Measure E passed the second time, is that they were presented with the stark reality that if we don't pass a parcel tax, there's going to be very difficult and challenging consequences. So what we have to do is try to inform the community as much as possible what these needs really are. I understand that we try to do that, but if it's happening, then great. If it's not happening, then we need to find other ways to engage and inform that community so we can meet those needs. I think that that's probably the first step in anything that we do. But it's not just us informing the community, it's the community informing us. Because anytime there's an election, I look at an election as a conversation between the community and the institution. And so the community will speak through its election and through its vote, but we need to give them the information so that they can have a properly informed conversation with us. And so I think we need to have a really serious or very detailed discussion with ourselves about what are the real needs that we have, and then be informed by various experts, Facilities Advisory Committee, maybe California School Services, whoever the institutions are there, or the assets that we have at our disposal to inform us of the tools that can be used to inform the community, and then have a meaningful conversation. And I don't mean this in a negative way. I think that you pose a very good question, because you're starting that conversation, which needs to be had. It doesn't matter what any one of us on the board wants or dreams that might be able to be achieved. It's what can we collectively do to get the community on board? What's needed to succeed? What are the needs? How do we get the information to show the community what our needs are? And how do we get everybody on board so that we can set up a plan? That is a crucial part of the discussion, is the community. Particularly in this community, as opposed to any other district. There's lots of districts around the state that they don't have to, and they don't necessarily rely on that local funding like we do. And so we have a certain amount of need that we need to bring that community in. Subject obviously to whatever the statutory, the institutional constraints are that we have as a public school. And that's one of the things also that we need to make sure that we're doing the best we can to inform the community that we have constraints. And if that is not necessarily conveyed as effectively as possible, then that's where we start to have a breakdown in communication, which can increase the chances of not succeeding. So as far as what we as a board might want for paying off a certain COP or dedicating funds to this or that, I think we need to hear from our community. Some meaningful surveys, maybe some opportunities for some town halls where community members can have an opportunity to be given information and then give input. And then obviously we make the decision on what to do, but the key here is to succeed. And the community is a major part of that success, or it doesn't work. So I didn't necessarily answer your question, but
There's no answer.
But I think
Yeah.
I think it's trying to set up a strategy on how we can best achieve what you're looking for, I think.
I think one of the things, one concern I do have though is if we're putting the cart before the horse, in terms of if we start talking about facilities without knowing what our future is instructionally and program wise. I know that our principals are starting to meet and really look at how to align our curriculum and instruction for pathways for students. What we have to really concentrate on at this point is what are we preparing our students for? Are we launching them prepared for college? Are we launching them prepared for careers? And how are we doing that with that consistency across? And I think before we get into facilities, I think we do need to really figure out where the principals are landing in terms of what they're seeing for the future of education. They're the experts. They're the ones who are on the ground. They're the ones interacting with our students, and knowing what they see and what they see as being important for us could drastically affect what we look for in our facilities. For example, if we're looking at creating more STEM pathways, really needing to invest in high-tech classrooms or maker spaces, those are things that we need to be building into a facility plan. So we can't, if we don't know if that's what our goal is, if there's no appetite for that from our community, then why spend the money there?
So one of the things that we're talking about in those meetings with all of our principals is contracting with a company who has professional researchers and demographers who can come out and develop a survey for our community. We would, of course, engage the Board of Education in that conversation so that we are crafting the right questions that are going to elicit the responses that are going to be most meaningful in terms of the board being able to make those kinds of decisions. And that will be helpful to the principals if we're talking about what types of programs the community would see as valuable. And we would like to keep all of the San Marino students in our public schools. And that's what we would like to achieve. And so what is it going to take to bring those kids back to public schools? How can we attract them to San Marino Unified School District? And we're really asking those tough questions. The principals are knee-deep involved in those conversations, and we really are, I feel like we're making progress, but we also need to hear the community's voice and then have the board weigh in. So we're working on all of those things now simultaneously. We do need a facilities needs assessment before the master plan. So if we can get that to the board, we can get that in front of you so that you see what our facility needs are now, and then get the principals to come up with those plans with the assistance of Dr. Richter. We can present that information to the board and you can make some meaningful decisions for our future.
So in keeping with that, right, and with what everybody has said, so I guess, would it be possible to, have kind of, and I don't mean a detailed timeline, right, but, kind of a general timeline about, when are the, when are the principals going to do the principals talk about it before we do the survey to the parents, right? Because the parents may not know about certain programs, they're not educators, right? So,
Right.
So should the principals go first, right? Should
Yes.
the parents go first? And I don't know the
Yeah,
answer
right.
to that. But kind of a general timeline. And so, when should we have a facilities advisory committee, right? Which is so
Yeah.
important, right? At what point should we go out for, a survey with respect to, the bond itself, not just, different programs. And it doesn't have to be detailed because we may need an expert, right, to help us do it the right way, right? I mean, it's one thing for us to think we know it, but there are people who do it, that's their job.
Yeah.
So for me, penny wise, pound foolish, right? I mean, if we need to hire somebody to make sure we do it right, then, I don't know, one school board member, I think it would be important to get that kind of input, but so I guess, for that part of it, and that's the right, facilities, the bond part of it, but there's still, I think, the bigger overarching question for all of us, which is, at what point and what decision do we make with respect to present, future?
My recommendation to the board is that we continue the planning with our principals because that's going to be our lifeline. We need to do something to stabilize and possibly grow our enrollment. And that to me is very urgent. And so the principals are meeting with the executive team every other Friday. And we're going to continue to do that until we have something tangible that we can present to the Board of Education. But I think we have to know what is possible in terms of articulated pathways of learning. And that's what we're exploring at that level currently. If we can come up with innovative ideas and the survey the public on whether or not those ideas are of interest to them, whether or not the board feels that it is worth exploring on that level, then we can go forward with surveying. And then the board can make decisions based on the results of that survey in terms of the direction that we go in.
Well, I will say, I know I already got it, like 4 surveys at the high school this week around all these different things. So I know
So they're
they've been
already
hard at
working,
work.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, one of the other things when we're talking about enrollment is something that I think may have been mentioned in a previous board meeting is the idea of a school within a school, a distance learning academy. If a distance learning academy was a viable source of increasing enrollment because it could bring inter-district transfers from all over the state of California through a distance learning academy, that solves potentially a lot of issues. It also is not dependent upon facilities. It's dependent more upon infrastructure with IT and so on. So that may be one of the options that are looked
Yes.
at as far as increasing enrollment.
Yes.
And finding out really what the actual cost is of that for educating a student in a high quality level of education compared to the ADA that's coming in for that student.
And that is one of the things that we are looking at and researching and hope to bring, information back to the board on that. It's a school within a school model, but it's all virtual. The only thing that we're concerned about, and I think one of you as board members brought this up, there's pros and cons to everything that we come up with. But, what we wouldn't want to do with a virtual academy is to pull kids away from on-campus learning and into a virtual experience, because then we may end up having to, close the school or something like that, which we would not want to do. So there's pros and cons to everything that we are studying. But yes, Mr. Kalaki, if we can pull kids from out of state or, up and down the state of California and enroll them in a San Marino Virtual Academy, that may be amazing. I don't know. We have to really vet all of these things out.
Yeah, I think it's an option. There's definitely potential pluses, potential minuses. And we can never fully predict the future. I think as Board President Ryan was pointing out earlier,
Yep, true.
COVID is not necessarily done, and we don't know when it will be done. And if that's the case, if we have students that are going to be more comfortable in a distance learning environment as opposed to an on-campus environment, it may not be that we're necessarily pulling them off of our campus. We're pulling them back into our district, because if these students are going to say, I will not be doing in-person learning, I will be searching for an alternative that's distance learning, then that's where you're potentially losing and your enrollment's going down. So yes, there may be a shift, but does it actually keep them in the district? It's not that you're pushing them one way or the other. As far as within the district, you're pushing them into the district.
Yes, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. We're going to study all those issues and bring information back to
And I
us.
think it's important that we explore every avenue.
Yeah,
Yeah, everything.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
So I think
absolutely.
that's really important.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to in
Yeah,
any
no,
way,
we could
but
move
we
on.
still have
Yeah.
Still have business to
to
tend to.
tend to, but I think this was very good discussion. So thank you, Ms. Chan, for bringing it up.
You have this listed as an action item, and then later on, information, discussion, action. So,
Yep.
what are you asking of me to do here?
Specifically, we are asking the board to take action on the adoption of the assignment of the 21-22 projected unrestricted ending balances. That's that one sheet that you asked a lot of questions on. Can you pull it back up, Steve? Thank you.
Number 6, page 16, or slide 16. I'm not sure it actually has a page number on it.
16?
It's in this
Yeah,
one.
there you go. Perfect. There it is. Thank you. And keeping in mind that this can change and, we will be bringing the first interim back to you in December for your consideration.
So I'm sorry, I just want to be perfectly clear. So
Sure.
you want us to approve this particular piece of paper?
Yes. Mhm.
Approve it on the grounds that,
Well, we're establishing, was this the right one?
because this is ending
Yeah, oh
balance.
yes, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the right one, but the right one's up there. Yes, so we are asking for the board to approve us moving $2 million into the assigned future cash flow. So we're moving that into Fund 17. And the future stabilization fund, 2.7 million would be moved into a stabilization fund. And approval of 3 years of COP future payments that we're setting aside. And putting aside $2.5 million for our anticipated declining enrollment.
Okay, so I want to be perfectly clear,
Yes.
right? Crystal clear. It's not this entire document you want us to approve.
It's not the entire, no, it is not the entire presentation.
It's the assigned, so for example, we're going to take assigned future cash flow.
Mhm.
Are we talking about $2 million for a 3-year projection or $2 million for just 2021, 22?
Yes,
Okay, so that's one. Then assigned future stabilization. Is that only for 2021, 22 or for 3 years out?
just,
Okay, then assigned COP future payments, is that for 3 years out or is just 1 year?
3 years out, it's about $500,000 a year.
That's for 3 years worth of payments.
Uh-huh.
But it's asking for the assignment for 21, 22, 1.5 million.
So you-
But so is it for 21, 22 or is
Yes.
it for 22, 23 and 23, 24?
we're set, go ahead.
Yeah, it's only for, we're asking to designate that for 21, 22.
So it's only for 21, 22.
Right.
That's what I just want to make clear.
Yeah.
Okay, and then assigned declining enrollment, it's $2.5 million for 21, 22
Right.
or the other 22, 23.
No, it's for only.
Okay, so for all of these assignments, it's simply only for the 2021, 22 year, right? It's not a 3-year projection that we're agreeing to. It's
No.
just for this year, right?
Correct.
On that note, are we actually agreeing to make a $1.5 million payment? We are just, so what we're being asked to approve is the assignation of the future cash flow for 2 million, future stabilization for 2.7, COP future payment 1.5, declining enrollment 2.5, only for the years of 21, 22.
Mhm.
And this is essentially just for budgeting purposes.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
because we are assigning the ending balance according to these funds for 21, 22.
Okay.
So we're, by the way, if we just approve for 21, 22, for the assigned COP payment,
Mhm.
is that the major donor already addressed for the 21, 22? So we don't have to.
Okay.
Well, just for the interest, right? I think the last one is at 21, 22,
Yes, but it's
pay for
not
the
enough to,
the interest, right?
no, all of it is, almost all of it is interest right now, but what Vanji is saying is that the donor committed to $2 million. And so the remaining balance that the donor will pay is about 367,000, which is less than
Yeah,
the amount we're gonna owe for 21, 22, which will be upwards of 400,000. So we will need to pay the difference.
so the difference between 1.5 to 400,000?
We budgeted that.
Right. Yeah.
No?
We budgeted that.
Yeah. So that's separate from this.
This is on
This
top of.
is,
Oh, yeah.
this is money that we're asking the board to allow us to budget to make 3 separate COP payments for 3 years out, if that's what we want to use it for, right? Because
No, that was just for this year. That's
Just
what
this
I'm,
year.
that's what I don't
we're doing,
understand.
yeah, we're taking the ending, not every year. It's not going to be for every year, right? Like putting 1.5 million.
So this should be 500, not 1.5.
No, because it's 3 payments worth and each payment is 500,000.
But we're
Every
only
year?
assigning that for this year only.
Right.
Well, I know, but you're telling us that every year there's going to be another another $500,000.
No, we're not.
No, that's just carrying over the assignment. That's not actually doing the action.
We're not showing you money spent
Oh,
in
it's just
this.
showing balance.
So that's what I guess the confusion is
Yeah.
for me, right? Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Chang, because I too was going to ask that question, right? So I just want to be crystal clear. The 1.5 million is over and above what the private donor has already agreed to pay in terms of the remaining amount, right?
Yes.
And the remaining amount that private donor is going to pay for this 2021-22 year is about 300,000 or 400,000, three something. So this 1.5 is above and beyond. But then there's my next question, which is, and again, I am not, this is your expertise, not mine, but as an individual, I don't understand if it's a $1.5 million and the debt is $500,000 per year, why are we doing 1.5, 1.5, 1.5?
It's,
So if this is not actual expense, it's sort of like the 3% for economic reserve. We're holding it. If we need to use it, we can, but this is just basically a placeholder for those dollars. And we're assigning our balance to go to those different things.
So that's a placeholder for 3 years though, then.
Correct. That's correct.
So then wouldn't it be 1.5 in 21-22 and then 0 and 0?
Well, that's assuming that we're not going to actually take the action and move it. In 21-22, we're just assigning it right now. We're not actually going to make those payments this year. We've designated part of our balance to be used for that if we want to.
So we're not talking about putting those towards the principal. These are
No.
just,
They're just.
think of it as
placeholders.
setting a reserve,
Yeah.
setting up a reserve to be used for that purpose. And you're doing that in this year, right?
Okay.
And you can use it if we had to make a payment from this account in 22-23, then that would go down to 1 million, right? And then in 22 or 23-24, it would go down to 500,000 if we're using it that way. But we may move money around because a budget is a living, breathing document. And sometimes if you have enough enrollment and you have enough revenue, you may not need to draw on this next year, but you have it there so that you can budget for, you can have 3 years worth of COP payments if you need to use it from this account. It's like a reserve.
I understand that it's a reserve, right?
it shouldn't be reducing the total.
Not unless you are for sure knowing that you're going to make a
We're
payment
not
from that.
spending it, we're just assigning
You're just
it.
assigning that.
You're just putting it
Because if we
Yeah.
do
in
it,
a savings account.
Yes,
And maybe it'll get
yes.
used, maybe it won't,
Yes,
but it's tied up.
Yes.
right. Just like we're not going to use, right? We're not going to dip into
Well-
that future cash flow money, that $2 million, unless we
Right.
have some emergency, right? But we're going to try to build that up.
No, and I understand, right? It's like a savings
We're just
account,
creating
right?
a bunch of
Or
different
whatever, right?
savings
For
I
that
get
purpose.
that concept, but even if we use that as a concept, the way I look at it, and I'm glad you explained it to me, but when I look at this, I think that it's going to be $1.5 million we're going to have a savings account for 1.5 million, right? 2021. And then 2022, we're going to add another $1.5 million in our savings account.
It's the same 1.5 carrying over.
Can I say, I think the reason why is because this deals with balances, not
Yes.
deposits.
Correct.
Right.
So the balance would be 1.5,
Yes.
and as long as it's not added to or spent, the balance will
Mhm.
continue to remain at 1.5. We're not adding, we're not depositing 1.5 every year.
That's right.
We're putting 1.5 in, and the balance will remain that amount.
Yep. And it's the ending balance in that fund.
I get
Here's the
it.
question that I have, though.
I kind of-
The
okay.
question I have is, we are talking about taking $10 million of our budget and assigning it to lots of different savings accounts.
Yes.
And therefore saying that money is tied up and no longer available for other things, right?
Yes. Yes.
So the question I have is, what other things might we need to consider that we need the money for? That this is now going to be saying, sorry, we don't have
But
that $10
that's,
million.
the board can always make adjustments. This is not locked in forevermore. If you need money for something, you can, the board can tell us that we can come to you and you can make that change. So this is not like a contract that you sign off on that is, permanent, a permanent decision. The board has the ability to approve, changes to the budget. So
Yeah, but I mean,
we're trying to make, to create a plan B for all of these things that we did not have before and we were criticized before for not having. And it's really critical that we have money, right, to support if the school's foundation can't make their annual commitment, or if, because we count on that and we budget it. And if it's not there, oh my gosh, now we have a $2 million gap, right? What if Measure R fails? What if, and Measure R isn't coming up until 2025. We have time for that. But the point is, we have to, over time, build up these funds to be able to have a sense of security so that you're not going to the public with your hand out every single time, something happens to disrupt our revenue.
I understand. My concern, though, is there are going to be things that are going to be popping up where there may be discussions where people are saying, how much money do we have available to do a certain type of thing?
Mhm.
And so is the response going to be, well, there's $10 million less of that money because we've done this. And so therefore it's not available for the discussion that's being had right now.
So I think Mr. Kalaki has a really good point,
Mhm.
but, and I'm so glad we did discuss all of this
And I
because,
don't
it was a
know if-
little confusing.
I don't know if my point is an open session issue or a closed session
I think it's a
issue.
closed session. issue.
And that's
And
what
if
I
it
was
is,
going
then
to
I
ask.
think that we
Yeah.
should wait on this until we have a closed session issue discussion.
For me, and to me, that's a possibility, but for me, what I was gonna say is it was confusing because we're talking about 22, 23, 24,
Mhm.
as opposed to just, if you had just given us this year, right, I could have understood it a little better. And it's my fault, right? Because I am not an accountant. Obviously, I don't know my numbers. So I apologize. No, you are the expert. My only reason for wanting to, my reason for doing it is because it is, just because we budgeted for one purpose now doesn't mean that we can't change it later. It's only for budgeting. It's only like a placeholder, right? And, if in the future, as you say, which I agree, right? If someone says, well, we've got this great program, I don't know, I'm making it up, right, for $2 million, we would come back to you guys and say, hey, listen, where in the budget can we take it out, right? So isn't that the issue? So that would be, okay. So anyway, so for me, I'm okay. I'm just saying,
again,
we
this
have
is-
to do it on a vote, but
This is something you can change at any time. This doesn't lock you in. If needs arise, we can revisit it.
I just think if it's going to potentially affect other things and there's, then I think, well, let me ask you this. Is there some urgency that this be voted on
Yes.
tonight?
There is for us because we really need to get this done so we can move on to the next phase of budgeting. It's really important.
it's required that the board take action if they're going to assign the
Yeah.
balances. If we don't, otherwise it drops down to undesignated, the entire amounts that we have now.
Is there some,
designated.
is there something that happens in the next 2 weeks that creates a problem?
Yes.
Uh,
It, yeah.
on this one.
Yeah, I mean, we really need to get this done.
Yes, I think that it sounds as though because of the way the budget calendar works, we're sort of locked into having to give you the opportunity to move on the next steps. If we don't make a decision tonight, then
Right.
we sort of box ourselves in to holding yet another special meeting, which I'm
Yes.
not even sure if we technically can for budget approvals. I don't think we
No, we
actually
can't.
can.
Well, that's what I'm
So,
asking.
yeah, so I think we are on a little bit of a time clock, but what we are ultimately going to be able to do is have another crack at finalizing this as our budget. This just allows you to move forward in
Yes.
developing the budget.
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And we have to make sure that we have these money set aside in a way that's going to be responsible, which is what we talked about earlier. And then, and I think I ran through the numbers and I figured out why we were getting confused. Because we thought we were putting money aside each year on top of, but now I ran it and I'm like, oh, I get it now. And that is why my husband is letting
Again,
me balance the
so,
checkbook.
our
I know.
apologies.
I'm so not allowed to balance a checkbook and that's is
I'm
why.
so sorry. So
Yes.
sorry.
So thank you. So I think, does that
What's the
answer your
timeline?
question?
I think that we need to do it
Yeah.
right. I would recommend that anyway, we need to, should we, what do you think?
My
we should
question is,
do?
what is the timeline?
Well, if we back ourselves into it, we have a December and then we only have
No,
one
we-
meeting in November and we have to make budget meetings before then. So.
Right.
we
So
back
I
ourselves
think
into
we,
it. I don't think we have
Right.
time, but
Right.
we will have another crack at all of,
We don't have time in the next 2 weeks.
because they have to develop the budget. They can't develop the budget if we don't
When's the budget
assign.
due?
Well, the budget for this year has already been approved by the board and sent to the county. So it's not, this is not changing the budget necessarily, other than assigning the ending balance projections, right? That's all we're doing. That's all we're asking to do. It's not a permanent thing. You can change it later if you want to.
so President Ryan and Mr. Kalaki, if you don't mind, we can still have discussion, but I'm going to make a motion to approve the assigned figures for this year, 2021, 22.
All right. Do I have a second?
A second.
All right. Thank you, Mrs. Jack. Thank you, Mrs. Chong. Roll call vote. Mrs. Jack,
Aye.
Mrs. Chong,
Aye.
Mr. Chang,
Aye.
Mr. Clarky.
I don't feel comfortable voting aye tonight on this issue, so nay.
All right. Mrs. Ryan, aye. Student board member. All right. Motion passes. It's a 4-1.
Thank you.
Next, we have 13B Parcel Tax Accountability Report 2020-21. Pearl, is it the-
Yeah, so this is an annual report that we bring forward to you for your approval. This is the accountability of the parcel tax funds for Measure R and E. It gives the allocation on how these funds were expended. This is a report that includes both Measure R and Measure E, and it lists all the different positions that are funded through these two parcel tax.
Any questions? Statement? This is also a discussion action item.
I make a motion to pass the report, to approve the reports.
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Jack. Thank you, Mr. Chang. Roll call vote. Mr. Clarky,
Aye.
Mr. Chang,
Aye.
Mrs. Chong.
Aye, but there was one typo. On page 4. Sorry, I should have
Looked at it like
four.
500 times, so I'm sorry. Which page?
On page 4, G,
on the actual annual fee report. Is this the parcel tax report? Or is it the?
Oh, I'm sorry. This was the developer one.
Oh, okay.
Nope, sorry. I'm sorry. My mistake.
Well, good heads up, though.
Sorry.
I'll look for the typo.
Yeah, sorry.
Aye.
Mrs. Jack,
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan, I, student board member. Motion passes. Now it's 13C, developer fee report 2020-21.
Yes. So in accordance with the Government Code 66006 and 6600, the district is filing a developer fee report with the board. This report discloses how much was collected in developer fees, as well as how those funds were spent in the 2021 year. And this also gives a history of how the monies were spent for the last 5 years. And again, this is for your approval for tonight.
So there was one typo.
Okay, G, yeah.
So on G, where it said loans made in the 2010-21 fiscal year, I assume that's supposed to be 2020-21 fiscal year.
Ah, yes.
Good catch.
I don't think there's an 11-year fiscal year.
Yeah,
difference.
you're right.
And then I did have a question,
Yes.
and I don't know, again, if you're going to know the answer to this, so I apologize. I asked you a lot of questions with
Yeah,
that
okay.
preface. On page 6, residential fees were consistently higher than what we saw in 2020-21. Any thoughts on what that was about and what we can anticipate in the future?
Okay, so in 1920, the residential fees were 175,000. And then you're asking the difference of the going down to 80,000. This only tells me that during the COVID year, people weren't remodeling their homes or building homes during this period of time. And those fees come in only when people are expanding their home or we're building new homes. And that construction probably came to a halt during that time, is my guess.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I don't know if it'll happen this year, but maybe next year we'll see it going back up.
I guess
That's-
everyone was expanding their outdoor living space. which
Yeah.
was- Right, and buying new couches. Okay.
So it's for-
Last year, City Hall closed, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you couldn't even get
Yeah.
your permits anyway, so,
Yeah,
okay, and we
this-
just don't know what we're looking at in the future then.
Right, and so this, generally, it's for building above 500 square feet or more. So people are, if they're doing construction, they're doing it under 500.
So what about conversions of ADUs then over 500? Would we see developer fee returns on that?
On what kind of?
ADUs.
ADU
I don't think
conversion?
she's familiar with the
I
change
guess
in the
I don't,
law.
that's not a question for Pearl again, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm
That
sorry.
is, sorry.
Well, I think this issue, we need to check the city, yeah.
Yes.
We'd have to
Make
talk to
sure
the city.
ADU, we
Right.
also get the money.
So there was a bill passed Pearl, that allows a rezoning, right, of single-family housing
Oh,
to provide, duplexes, I believe, on a single property. So if you sell your house in San Marino, somebody buys it, they can build a duplex.
so that again would be, I don't know what the city requires in terms
Mhm.
of their requirements, so.
It just depends. But
And
you're
they're
right,
they're actually the ones that are collecting the developer fees
Which
for
is-
us, so.
which is interesting and different, right?
Yeah, it's that was the first time for me. Usually a school district collects its own developer. fees,
Yeah.
So that was a little different when I heard that.
Right.
That's how we do it here. Yeah. So,
All right, with the amendment to the date, and this is an action item.
I move to approve the developer fee report.
Thank you, Mrs. Chong. Thank you, Mr. Chang. Roll call, Mrs. Jack,
Aye.
Mrs. Chong,
Aye.
Mr. Chang,
Aye.
Mr. Kalaki,
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan, aye. Student board member. Thank you. The motion has passed. Board superintendent discussion items. No?
We
All
need to find how many convertible for the
Oh, do we
parade.
need
right?
we need more convertibles?
We need
For the
approximately
parade, right?
3 to 4 cars.
Is that including or excluding mine?
Excluding.
Okay, excluding, okay.
Oh, no, including, sorry. That's including.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay, we'll
If-
leave it to,
Yeah,
all right.
we'll send out an all call.
Are we gonna have to resort to pickup truck beds
Maybe, we
and
may,
bales of hay?
yeah.
Is there anything else? you have?
All right, so the meeting is adjourned.
Okay, so you guys know that I'm driving the president, right?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Just want to make sure. 'cause
You're
I-
all set,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Next weekend, right? Next Friday. Next week.